Friday morning arrived with Henri's return, but the atmosphere in the Blackwood mansion had changed completely. When the French chef appeared in the kitchen at his usual early hour, expecting to resume his normal routine, he found both brothers waiting for him in the dining room with serious expressions. "Henri," Alexander began, "we need to discuss some changes to our meal arrangements." The chef looked puzzled. In 5 years of employment, the brothers had never given him specific direction, beyond asking him to prepare something impressive for their various social and business functions. "We want you to work with Maria," Sebastian continued. "She's been cooking for us while you were away, and we've learned a lot about what we actually enjoy eating." Henri's expression shifted from confusion to barely concealed outrage. The idea of collaborating with domestic staff was completely foreign to his understanding of professional hierarchy. He had trained in the finest restaurants in Paris and had built his reputation on sophisticated culinary artistry, not simple home cooking. "I'm not sure I understand," Henri said carefully. "Maria is a maid, not a chef. Surely you don't want to compromise the quality of your meals." Both brothers recognized the condescension in his tone, and for the first time they found it offensive rather than normal. A week ago, they would have agreed with Henri's perspective without question. Now, having experienced what food could taste like when it was prepared with care rather than just skill, they saw his attitude as ignorant rather than sophisticated. "Actually," Alexander replied firmly, "we want to improve the quality of our meals. Maria understands something about cooking that we think you could learn from." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Henri struggled to accept that his elaborate preparations had been less satisfying than simple home cooking, while the brothers tried to explain their desire for food that nourished their spirits as well as their bodies. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Henri would remain as head chef, but Maria would work with him to bring a different approach to their meals. Some days would feature Henri's sophisticated preparations for business entertaining, while others would showcase Maria's comforting, soulful cooking for their private meals. The first collaborative breakfast was awkward. Henri watched Maria work with barely disguised skepticism, clearly expecting to identify flaws in her technique. But as he observed her careful attention to flavor balance and her instinctive understanding of what would please the people eating her food, his attitude began to shift. When the brothers tasted the meal, a combination of Henri's technical skill and Maria's emotional intelligence, their faces showed the same pleasure and satisfaction that Maria's solo efforts had produced. Henri, despite his professional pride, couldn't deny the evidence of their genuine enjoyment. Over the following weeks, something beautiful happened in the Blackwood kitchen. Henri began asking Maria questions about her grandmother's techniques and her understanding of comfort food. Maria learned from Henri's expertise with ingredients and his knowledge of flavor combinations. Their collaboration created meals that were both sophisticated and satisfying, technically excellent and emotionally nourishing, but the changes extended far beyond the kitchen. The brothers began eating together more often, using mealtime as an opportunity to actually connect with each other rather than just conduct business. They started noticing other staff members as individuals with their own skills and stories. Alexander learned that their gardener had studied botany and began consulting him about which vegetables to grow for the kitchen. Sebastian discovered that their housekeeper spoke 4 languages and asked her to help him improve his Spanish. Maria's role in the household evolved as well. She was no longer just a maid, but a valued member of the kitchen team. The brothers insisted on paying her a salary that reflected her cooking skills, and they encouraged her to bring her daughter for visits. When the young girl arrived from her home country, she was amazed to find her mother working alongside a famous chef and being treated with genuine respect by wealthy employers. The mansion's dining room, once a formal space reserved for impressing business associates, became a place where real conversations happened over meals that actually tasted good. Friends and colleagues began commenting on how much more relaxed and happy both brothers seemed, though they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. 6 months later, Alexander made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He offered to help Maria open a new restaurant, providing both financial backing and business guidance. But this wouldn't be a fancy establishment designed to impress food critics. It would be a place that served the kind of honest, nourishing food that had changed his own relationship with eating. "I want other people to experience what we experienced," he explained to Sebastian. "Food that makes you feel at home, no matter where you are or how difficult your day has been." The restaurant opened a year later, with Henri as head chef and Maria as the heart and soul of the operation. It became known not for elaborate presentations or expensive ingredients, but for food that made people feel loved and cared for. Business executives discovered the pleasure of simple, perfectly prepared meals. Families found a place where children were welcomed and where conversation flowed as easily as the wine. The Blackwood brothers remained regular customers, but they often sat at a small table in the corner, rather than demanding special treatment. They had learned that the best meals weren't about displaying wealth or status, but about sharing honest food with people you cared about. Sometimes, late in the evening when the restaurant was closing, Maria would sit with the brothers and share stories about her grandmother's cooking or her daughter's progress in school. These conversations reminded all of them that the most important ingredient in any meal wasn't exotic spices or expensive techniques, but the simple human desire to take care of each other. The transformation that had begun with one emergency, breakfast, had rippled outward, changing not just how they ate but how they lived. Alexander found himself sleeping better and feeling less stressed about business pressures. Sebastian's relationships improved as he learned to value authenticity over sophistication, and Maria discovered that her years of quiet service had prepared her for something much greater than she had ever imagined. Their mansion still employed many staff members, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of invisible servants, performing duties for indifferent employers, the household had become a community of people who knew and respected each other. Meals were shared, stories were exchanged, and everyone understood that their contributions mattered. Years later, when business magazines wrote articles about the Blackwood brothers' success, they often mentioned their unusual approach to corporate dining and employee relations. But the journalists never quite captured the real story: how two privileged men had discovered their own humanity through the simple act of eating food prepared with love by someone who saw them as people rather than just employers. The lesson had been profound but simple. The most nourishing meals aren't necessarily the most expensive or elaborate ones. Sometimes the food that changes everything is made by someone who cooks not to impress, but to care for the people who will eat it. And sometimes, the most important conversations happen not in boardrooms or fancy restaurants, but around a simple table where people share honest food and open their hearts to each other. Maria's daughter eventually joined the family business, bringing her own innovations while maintaining her mother's commitment to cooking with love. The restaurant expanded, but never lost its essential character: a place where food was prepared and served with the understanding that nourishing people's bodies and spirits was one of life's most important responsibilities. The Blackwood brothers had learned that true luxury wasn't about having access to the most expensive things, but about experiencing genuine care and connection in even the simplest moments. A perfectly cooked egg shared with people who mattered could be worth more than the most elaborate feast eaten in isolation. And every morning when they sat down to breakfast, whether at home or at the restaurant, they remembered the day when a brave maid had offered to cook for them, and how that single act of kindness had changed everything about the way they understood food, relationships, and what it really meant to be well fed. By Thursday morning, something fundamental had changed in the Blackwood mansion. For the first time in their lives, the brothers were actually looking forward to breakfast, rather than just expecting it to appear. They arrived in the dining room 10 minutes early, and instead of sitting at opposite ends of the long table, they had unconsciously moved closer together, taking seats where they could actually have a conversation. Maria had noticed the change, too. The cold, distant atmosphere that usually filled the dining room had been replaced by something warmer. The brothers were talking to each other, really talking, instead of just exchanging brief business updates. More importantly, they had started talking to her, asking questions about her cooking and actually listening to her answers. This morning, she had prepared something special, a dish her grandmother had called sunshine eggs. She had hollowed, out thick slices of Henri's artisanal bread, cracked fresh eggs into the centers and baked them until the whites were set but the yolks were still golden and runny. She served them with roasted vegetables from the garden and strips of perfectly crisp bacon that she had cooked slowly until they were golden brown. The presentation was rustic and homey, completely different from Henri's architectural food arrangements. But when the brothers saw it, their faces lit up with genuine pleasure. This looked like comfort food, like something that would actually make them feel good instead of just impressing their guests. "Maria," Sebastian said as she set down his plate, "I have to ask you something. Henri has been our chef for 5 years and he's supposedly one of the best in the city. But honestly, I've never enjoyed eating as much as I have these past 3 days. How is that possible?" Maria smiled, pleased that they were comfortable enough to ask such personal questions. "Henri is very skilled, and he creates beautiful food. But I think maybe he forgets that food is supposed to make people happy, not just look impressive. When I cook, I'm thinking about the person who will eat it, wondering if it will bring them joy." Alexander paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "You think about us when you cook?" "Of course," Maria replied, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "I watch you both during the day and I can see when you're stressed or tired. This morning you both seemed worried about something, so I wanted to make food that would feel comforting." She was right. Alexander had been dealing with a complicated merger that was keeping him up at night, and Sebastian was struggling with a relationship that was falling apart. Neither had mentioned these concerns to anyone, but somehow Maria had sensed their emotional state and responded to it through her cooking. The realization that someone in their household had been paying attention to their well-being, caring about their happiness, was overwhelming. For years they had been surrounded by staff who performed their duties efficiently, but without any personal investment. Maria was different. She saw them as real people, rather than just employers to be managed. As they ate, the brothers found themselves sharing more about their lives than they had in months. The food created an atmosphere of intimacy and comfort that made conversation feel natural and easy. They talked about work pressures, personal disappointments, and dreams they hadn't shared with anyone in years. "This is going to sound strange," Alexander said, "but I think this is the most relaxed I've felt in our house ever. Usually even meals feel like performances, like we're playing roles rather than just being ourselves." Sebastian nodded in agreement. "I was thinking the same thing. When Henri cooks, I feel like I'm supposed to appreciate the artistry and sophistication. But with Maria's food, I just feel happy." Maria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. These powerful, wealthy men were talking about happiness as if it was something rare and precious in their lives. She thought about her own daughter, thousands of miles away, and how they shared simple meals together over video calls, laughing and talking about their days. She realized that the brothers had never experienced that kind of basic human connection around food. "In my family," she said softly, "we believe that sharing a meal is one of the most important things people can do together. It's not just about feeding the body, it's about feeding the soul. When you cook for someone with love, and when you eat together with gratitude, something magical happens." The words hung in the air as both brothers considered what she had said. They had attended thousands of business meals, social dinners, and elaborate events, but they had never thought of eating as something that could nourish their spirits as well as their bodies. That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Alexander canceled his usual lunch meeting and asked Maria if she would prepare something simple that he could eat in the garden. He wanted to experience her cooking in a different setting, away from the formal dining room and all its associations with business and obligation. She prepared a simple sandwich using leftover roasted vegetables and fresh bread, and Alexander found himself sitting on a bench under a tree he had never really noticed before, eating lunch with his hands like a normal person. The experience was so foreign that it felt almost rebellious, but it also felt more real than any meal he could remember. When Sebastian returned home that evening, he found his brother still sitting in the garden, looking more peaceful than he had seen him in years. Without saying anything, Sebastian sat down beside him and they watched the sunset together in comfortable silence. "I think we need to talk to Henry when he comes back," Alexander said finally. Sebastian knew exactly what his brother meant. Their whole relationship with food, with their staff, and maybe even with each other was going to have to change. They couldn't go back to the old way of eating after experiencing what it felt like to be truly nourished, both physically and emotionally. The rest of that Tuesday passed differently than usual for both brothers. Alexander found himself distracted during his conference calls, not by business concerns, but by the memory of breakfast. He couldn't stop thinking about how the food had tasted, how it had made him feel satisfied in a way that expensive restaurant meals never did. The experience had been so unusual that he kept replaying it in his mind, trying to understand what had been different. Sebastian was having similar thoughts. During his lunch meeting at an exclusive downtown restaurant, he found himself comparing the elaborately presented meal to Maria's simple breakfast. The restaurant's food looked impressive, arranged like artwork on the plate, but it tasted hollow, somehow. Every bite reminded him of the honest flavors he had experienced that morning. When Henri's assistant called to report that the chef would need several more days to recover, both brothers felt something unexpected. Relief rather than annoyance. The thought of returning to their usual routine of elaborate meals suddenly seemed less appealing than it had just 24 hours earlier. That evening, as they sat in the formal dining room waiting for their dinner to be delivered from their favorite French restaurant, Sebastian broke the unusual silence that had settled between them. "Are you thinking about breakfast too?" he asked. Alexander looked up from his phone, surprised by the directness of the question. "Yes," he admitted. "I can't stop thinking about it. I've never had food that tasted so real." "Do you think she would cook for us again?" The question hung in the air between them. Both brothers knew they were considering something that went against everything they had been taught about maintaining proper social boundaries. Employees were supposed to stay in their designated roles, and eating food prepared by domestic staff was simply not done in their social circle. But the memory of that morning's meal was stronger than their social conditioning. They had both experienced something genuine for the first time in years, and the appeal of repeating that experience was becoming impossible to ignore. When their dinner arrived from the French restaurant, they ate it mechanically, both aware that it tasted exactly like what it was: expensive food prepared by strangers who didn't know or care about the people who would eat it. The presentation was flawless, the ingredients were premium, but something essential was missing. The next morning, both brothers appeared in the dining room earlier than usual, though neither acknowledged that they were hoping Maria might offer to cook again. They sat at opposite ends of the long table, pretending to read emails while actually listening for sounds from the kitchen. Maria appeared right on schedule, carrying her cleaning supplies toward the stairs. When she saw the brothers sitting in the empty dining room, she paused just as she had the day before. The memory of their genuine appreciation for her cooking had given her confidence she hadn't felt in years. "Good morning," she said, addressing both of them. "Henri's assistant called to say he will be out until Friday. Would you like me to prepare breakfast again?" The eagerness with which both brothers accepted surprised all three of them. Within minutes, Maria was back in the kitchen, and the brothers were sitting in anticipation rather than impatience. The shift in their attitudes was remarkable. Instead of treating the delay as an inconvenience, they seemed to be looking forward to whatever she might create. This time, Maria decided to be a bit more adventurous. She prepared what she called her grandmother's pancakes, made from scratch, with ingredients she found in Henri's well-stocked pantry. But these weren't the thick, heavy pancakes served at American restaurants. They were thin, delicate creations that she filled with fresh berries and a light cream cheese mixture, then folded elegantly and dusted with just a touch of powdered sugar. She also prepared fresh orange juice, squeezing the oranges by hand instead of using the expensive juicing machine that Henri preferred. The result was juice that tasted bright and alive, with little bits of pulp that reminded anyone drinking it that it came from actual fruit. When she served the meal, both brothers noticed immediately that she had used different dishes. Instead of their formal china, she had chosen simple white plates that let the food be the focus. The pancakes looked beautiful, but approachable, and the orange juice was served in regular glasses rather than crystal. The first bite was even more revelatory than the previous day's breakfast had been. The pancakes were impossibly light and flavorful, with the berries providing little bursts of sweetness that complemented rather than overwhelmed the delicate batter. The cream cheese mixture added richness without making the dish feel heavy. "This is incredible," Sebastian said, and this time there was no surprise in his voice. He was beginning to expect that Maria's food would be exceptional, though he still couldn't understand why it was so different from anything else they had ever eaten. Alexander was eating more slowly, savoring each bite in a way that was completely foreign to his usual approach to meals. "Maria," he said, looking up at her as she started to leave the room, "can I ask you something?" She stopped and turned back, curious about what he might want to know. "Why does your food taste so different from what we usually eat? The restaurants we go to are supposed to be the best in the city with famous chefs and expensive ingredients, but this tastes better than anything I've ever had." Maria considered the question carefully. She had worked for the family long enough to understand their lifestyle, and she had seen Henri's elaborate preparations many times while cleaning the kitchen. "I think," she said slowly, "that those chefs are cooking to impress people, to show how clever and skilled they are. I'm cooking to feed people, to make them happy and satisfied. When you cook with love instead of ego, food tastes different." The simplicity of her explanation struck both brothers as profound. They had spent their entire lives eating food that was designed to demonstrate status and sophistication, but they had never considered what food might taste like when it was prepared, with the simple intention of nourishing and pleasing the people who would eat it. 18 minutes later, Maria appeared in the dining room doorway carrying a simple wooden tray. She had chosen the most basic serving pieces she could find, knowing that elaborate presentation wouldn't match the honest simplicity of what she had prepared. The contrast was striking against the formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and gold-trimmed china cabinet. She placed 2 plates in front of the brothers, and immediately the entire atmosphere of the room changed. Instead of Henri's usual artistic arrangements that looked more like sculptures than food, Maria had prepared something that actually looked like a meal someone might enjoy eating. The eggs were perfectly cooked, fluffy and golden, mixed with bright red tomatoes and green herbs that made the plate look alive with color. Alongside the eggs, she had prepared slices of Henri's expensive bread, but instead of serving it cold, with fancy butter, she had toasted it until it was golden and warm, then rubbed it lightly with fresh garlic and drizzled it with olive oil. The final touch was a small portion of fresh fruit, cut simply and arranged naturally rather than carved into decorative shapes. Alexander stared down at his plate with an expression of complete bewilderment. This was not what food looked like, in his world. Where were the elaborate sauces, the artistic swirls, the ingredients he couldn't pronounce? This looked like something a normal person might eat, and he wasn't sure how to react to that. Sebastian picked up his fork first, examining the eggs with curiosity. "It smells incredible," he admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. Maria stood nearby, not quite sure what to do with herself. In all her years working for the family, she had never remained in the dining room while they... She started to retreat toward the kitchen, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, still staring at his plate. "This is very different from what we usually eat." For a moment, Maria worried that she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps they were offended by the simplicity, or maybe they expected her to somehow recreate Henri's complex style. "I'm sorry, sir, I can prepare something else if you prefer." "No," Sebastian said quickly, taking his first bite. The moment the food hit his tongue, his eyes widened in genuine surprise. The taste was so different from what he was accustomed to that it took his brain a few seconds to process what was happening. The eggs were creamy and rich, but the herbs added a brightness that made everything taste fresh and alive. The tomatoes actually tasted like tomatoes rather than ingredients in a complex sauce. Alexander watched his brother's reaction with growing curiosity. Sebastian had stopped talking entirely and was focused on eating with an intensity that Alexander had never seen before. This was the same brother who usually pushed food around his plate while talking on the phone or checking social media. Finally, Alexander took his first bite, and the effect was immediate and overwhelming. For 25 years he had eaten food prepared by the world's most expensive chefs, but he had never tasted anything like this. It wasn't that the flavors were complex or exotic. It was the opposite. Everything tasted exactly like what it was supposed to taste like, but more intensely and purely than he had ever experienced. The bread was crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, with the garlic adding just enough flavor without overpowering anything else. The olive oil was the same expensive brand that Henri used, but somehow it tasted different when used simply rather than as part of an elaborate preparation. Both brothers ate in complete silence, which was unprecedented. Usually their meals were filled with business discussions, phone calls, or conversations about their social schedules. But this food demanded attention in a way that their usual elaborate meals never had. Maria watched their reactions with growing amazement. She had seen many people enjoy her cooking over the years, but these two had never experienced food that wasn't designed to impress rather than satisfy. The way they were eating with complete focus and obvious pleasure told her everything she needed to know about how different this meal was from their usual routine. "This is remarkable," Alexander said finally, looking up at Maria with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't the cold politeness he usually showed to staff, or the dismissive indifference that was more common. He looked genuinely impressed, and maybe even grateful. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Sebastian asked, setting down his fork, only because his plate was completely empty. Maria felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "My grandmother taught me when I was very young. She always said that cooking was about making people happy, not showing off. In my restaurant, I tried to serve food that felt like a hug from someone who cared about you." The brothers exchanged another look, but this time it was different from their earlier glances. Something had shifted in their understanding, not just about food, but about the person who had prepared it. For 3 years, Maria had been invisible to them, but now they were seeing her as someone with knowledge, skill, and even wisdom that they had never recognized. Alexander checked his watch and realized something surprising. His conference call was starting in 2 minutes, but for the first time in years, he didn't want to finish eating quickly to get on with business. He wanted to sit with this meal a little longer, to understand why it felt so different from anything he had experienced before. "I have to take this call," he said reluctantly. "But this was exceptional. Thank you." Sebastian nodded in agreement. "Seriously, this was better than most of the restaurants we go to." As the brothers headed to their respective offices for their morning meetings, Maria began clearing the plates with a smile she couldn't suppress. She had spent years cleaning up after meals that were barely touched, watching expensive food get thrown away because the brothers were too distracted to actually eat it. But these plates were completely clean, evidence that her food had been not just eaten but truly enjoyed. Alexander stared at Maria as if she had just suggested they eat dirt from the garden. The idea of consuming food prepared by domestic help was so absurd that he couldn't immediately form a response. Sebastian looked equally shocked, his mouth slightly open as he processed what the maid had just offered. "You want to cook for us?" Sebastian asked, his tone carrying disbelief rather than anger. Maria nodded, maintaining eye contact despite feeling intimidated by their intense stares. "Yes, sir. I know Henri keeps the kitchen well stocked, and I have experience cooking. I used to own a restaurant back home." The twins exchanged glances across the dining table. Neither had ever considered that any of their staff might have lives, skills, or experiences beyond their current positions. The revelation that their maid had once owned a restaurant was as surprising as if she had claimed to be a former astronaut. Alexander's practical mind began working through the situation. His first conference call was in 25 minutes, and he couldn't conduct business with his stomach growling. The nearest acceptable restaurant was at least 15 minutes away, and ordering delivery would take even longer. He looked at Maria again, this time actually seeing her as a person rather than just another piece of furniture in his house. "What kind of restaurant?" he asked, his business instincts kicking in. If he was going to consider this unusual arrangement, he needed to assess the risk. "A small family place," Maria replied, encouraged by his question. "We serve traditional food from my country, but I also learned to cook many international dishes. I worked in the kitchen for 15 years before I came here." Sebastian leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. The situation was so far outside their normal routine that it almost felt like an adventure. What would you make? Maria thought quickly. She knew the kitchen well from her cleaning duties and was familiar with Henri's ingredients. I could make fresh eggs, perhaps, with some herbs from the garden. There are beautiful tomatoes and peppers in the refrigerator, and I noticed Henri has excellent bread that I could toast properly. Something simple but fresh. The word fresh caught Alexander's attention. Despite all the expensive restaurants and famous chefs, he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten something that felt truly fresh rather than elaborately prepared and presented. Most of his meals were artistic arrangements that prioritized appearance over simplicity. How long would it take? Alexander asked, checking his watch again. 15 minutes, maybe 20 at most, Maria answered confidently. The brothers looked at each other again, having an entire conversation with just their expressions. This was completely unprecedented. They had never eaten food prepared by any of their household staff, and the idea went against everything they had been taught about maintaining proper boundaries between social classes. But their stomachs were empty, time was running short, and something about Maria's quiet confidence suggested she actually knew what she was doing. Besides, it was just one meal, and Henri would be back tomorrow to restore their normal routine. All right, Alexander said finally, surprising both Sebastian and himself. But we have calls starting soon, so it needs to be quick. Maria's face lit up with a smile that neither brother had ever seen before. For 3 years, she had been essentially invisible to them, but now she felt acknowledged as a real person with actual skills to offer. Thank you, sir. I'll start right away. As Maria hurried toward the kitchen, Sebastian shook his head in amazement. I can't believe we're about to eat food made by the maid. Alexander was already back to checking his phone, but he paused at his brother's comment. It's just breakfast, Sebastian. How different can it be? In the kitchen, Maria felt a familiar excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about preparing a meal. It was about proving herself and showing these privileged men what real cooking could taste like. She moved efficiently through Henri's perfectly organized kitchen, gathering ingredients with the confidence of someone who truly belonged in this space. She selected eggs that were still slightly warm, evidence of their freshness. The vegetables Henri kept were indeed excellent quality, probably better than what she'd had access to in her own restaurant. She found herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill and picked a few leaves, crushing them gently to release their fragrance. As she worked, Maria thought about the irony of the situation. Here she was, cooking in a kitchen worth more than most people's entire homes for 2 men who had probably never appreciated a simple, well-prepared meal. She had spent years serving them by cleaning their rooms and doing their laundry, but now she was finally able to serve them in the way that felt most natural to her. The eggs sizzled softly in the pan as she added the fresh herbs and vegetables. The smell that filled the kitchen was completely different from Henri's elaborate preparations. This was the smell of home cooking, of food made with care rather than complexity. Back in the dining room, both brothers found themselves unconsciously noticing the aromas drifting from the kitchen. Neither would admit it, but there was something appealing about the simple, honest smells compared to the often overwhelming fragrances of Henri's gourmet creations. Alexander tried to focus on his emails but kept glancing toward the kitchen door. He couldn't remember the last time he had actually felt curious about food, rather than just expecting it to appear. Sebastian was openly intrigued, having abandoned his phone entirely to pay attention to what was happening. Do you think it will actually be edible? Sebastian asked quietly. Alexander shrugged, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was wondering the same thing. For the first time in years, they were about to eat something prepared not by a celebrity chef or expensive restaurant, but by someone who actually seemed excited about the process of cooking itself. Alexander and Sebastian Blackwood had never known hunger. Born into the wealthiest family in the city, the 25-year-old twins lived in a mansion that stretched across 50 acres of perfectly manicured gardens. Their father owned half the commercial buildings downtown, and their mother came from old money that traced back generations. Everything they ate came from the finest restaurants or was prepared by world-renowned chefs who flew in from Paris, Tokyo, or New York just to cook for them. The brothers were identical in looks but completely different in personality. Alexander was the serious one, always dressed in expensive suits, spending his days managing the family business empire. He spoke little and smiled even less, treating everyone around him with cold professionalism. Sebastian was the charmer, with an easy, laugh and quick wit but equally spoiled and demanding. Both had never stepped foot in a kitchen, never touched a dirty dish, and certainly never eaten food prepared by someone they considered beneath their social status. Their mansion employed dozens of staff members, from gardeners to security guards, but the twins barely acknowledged their existence. The servants were like invisible ghosts moving through their lives, cleaning up after them, organizing their schedules, and ensuring their comfort without ever being truly seen. Among these invisible people was Maria Santos, a 42-year-old woman who had worked as a maid in the Blackwood mansion for 3 years. Maria was different from the other staff. She had once owned a small restaurant in her home country before circumstances forced her to leave everything behind and start over in America. She sent most of her earnings back home to support her teenage daughter and elderly mother. Every morning, she arrived at the mansion before dawn and worked until late evening, cleaning rooms, doing laundry, and maintaining the pristine appearance that the Blackwood family demanded. The twins had a strict routine when it came to meals. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 in the morning in the formal dining room, prepared by their personal chef, Henri Dubois. Lunch was usually eaten at their respective offices or exclusive restaurants. Dinner was an elaborate affair, often with business associates or potential partners, featuring multiple courses and wines that cost more than most people's monthly salary. On this particular Tuesday morning, everything seemed normal. Alexander was reviewing quarterly reports while Sebastian scrolled through social media, both waiting for Henri to serve their usual breakfast of imported pastries, exotic fruits, and freshly ground coffee from beans that cost $300 per pound. The massive dining room table, which could seat 20 people, seemed almost empty with just the two brothers sitting at opposite ends. Minutes passed, and no breakfast appeared. Alexander checked his expensive watch and frowned. Henri was never late. Punctuality was one of the few things that mattered to him more than the actual taste of food. Sebastian looked up from his phone, also noticing the delay. "Where is Henri?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone unaccustomed to being kept waiting. Sebastian shrugged, already reaching for his phone to call the chef. After several rings, Henri's assistant answered, explaining in rapid French that the chef had been rushed to the hospital with severe food poisoning. The assistant apologized profusely and promised to find a replacement immediately, but it would take at least 3 hours. The twins stared at each other across the long table. 3 hours without breakfast was unthinkable. They had important meetings, business calls, and a schedule that couldn't be delayed. Alexander's jaw tightened as he considered their options. They could drive to one of their favorite restaurants, but traffic was horrible at this hour, and they both had conference calls starting in 30 minutes. "We could order something," Sebastian suggested, though the idea of eating delivered food seemed almost as foreign as cooking for themselves. Alexander shook his head. "Everything will be cold by the time it gets here, and you know how I feel about eating food that's been sitting in containers." As they debated their limited options, Maria happened to walk past the dining room carrying fresh linens. She noticed the empty table and the frustrated expressions on the brothers' faces. Having worked in the mansion for 3 years, she understood their routines better than they realized. She knew Henri must be absent, which explained why the kitchen was quiet, and the brothers looked irritated. For a moment, Maria hesitated at the doorway. In her 3 years of employment, she had never spoken directly to either twin unless they specifically addressed her, which was rare. They lived in completely different worlds, separated by money, class, and expectations. But something about their predicament stirred a memory of her own restaurant, where she had taken pride in feeding people and seeing their faces light up after tasting her food. The brothers continued their discussion, completely unaware of Maria's presence. She watched them for another moment, These two powerful men who controlled millions of dollars but couldn't solve the simple problem of making themselves breakfast. The irony wasn't lost on her, and despite knowing she might be overstepping boundaries, she found herself clearing her throat softly. Both Alexander and Sebastian turned toward the sound, surprised to see one of their staff members standing there. They looked at her with the same expression they might give a piece of furniture that had suddenly started talking. Maria felt her heart racing, but she had already committed to speaking. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly, addressing Alexander since he seemed to be the more serious one. "I couldn't help but notice that Henri is not here today. If you would like, I could prepare something for you in the kitchen." The suggestion hung in the air like something completely foreign. The idea of eating food prepared by a maid, in their own kitchen, was so far outside their normal experience that neither brother immediately responded.